This story was sent to me by Sarah Martinez via email, and it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I thought I was going to die in that basement. The smell of mold and something else I didn't want to identify filled my lungs as I heard footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, like whoever was up there was deciding what to do next. But let me back up and tell you how this all started. I'd been working as a paramedic for about 3 years when this happened. It was a Tuesday night shift in October, one of those crisp autumn evenings where you can smell wood smoke in the air. My partner Jake and I had just finished a routine transport when we got the call around 11:30 p.m. Elderly male, possible heart attack, rural address about 20 minutes outside the city limits. Nothing unusual about that. We got calls like this all the time. The GPS led us down increasingly narrow roads until we were driving through what felt like the middle of nowhere. Old farmhouses dotted the landscape, most of them dark except for the occasional porch light. When we finally found an address, it was a weathered 2-story house set back from the road, surrounded by overgrown trees that seemed to swallow our headlights. The house looked abandoned at first glance, paint peeling off the siding, shutters hanging at odd angles, and a front porch that sagged under the weight of accumulated junk. But there was a dim light flickering in one of the upstairs windows, and our dispatch had confirmed this was the right address. Jake parked the ambulance and we grabbed our gear. The front door opened before we even knocked. A woman in her 40s stood there, her hair disheveled and her clothes rumpled like she'd been sleeping, but her eyes were wide awake, darting between us nervously. She introduced herself as Linda and let us inside without much explanation, just kept saying her father was downstairs and needed help immediately. The house smelled like neglect and something sour I couldn't place. Our flashlights revealed rooms filled with stacks of newspapers, boxes, and furniture covered in dust sheets. Linda led us toward a door I assumed was a closet, but when she opened it, there were stairs leading down into complete darkness. "He's down there," she said, not meeting our eyes. "He collapsed about an hour ago. I tried to move him, but he's too heavy." Jake and I exchanged glances. Something felt off, but we dealt with hoarders and people living in difficult conditions before. We followed her down the creaking wooden stairs, our equipment bags bumping against the narrow walls. The basement was worse than the upstairs. The ceiling was so low that Jake, who was 6'2", had to duck. Water stains covered the concrete walls, and the floor was a maze of cardboard boxes and old furniture. In the far corner, barely visible in the beam of our flashlights, was an elderly man lying motionless on a dirty mattress. As we moved toward him, I noticed there was no clear path. We had to climb over and around obstacles, making it nearly impossible to work efficiently. The man appeared to be unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. I knelt beside him to check his vitals while Jake tried to clear some space for our equipment. That's when I heard the door at the top of the stairs close. Not slam, just close with a soft click that somehow sounded final. "Linda?" I called, but there was no response. Jake and I looked at each other and I could see my own unease reflected in his face. He made his way back toward the stairs, stepping carefully around the clutter. "The door's locked," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm, "and I don't see a handle or knob on this side." My heart started beating faster. I looked down at the elderly man, whose breathing seemed more labored now. His pulse was weak and thready, and his skin was cold and clammy. But as I continued my assessment, something didn't feel right about the whole situation. His positioning looked deliberate, not like someone who had collapsed naturally. Jake was back beside me now, and I could see the worry in his eyes. We both tried our radios, but we were getting nothing but static. The thick walls in our location underground were blocking the signal. "We need to get him out of here," I whispered. But as I said it, I heard those footsteps above us, slow, measured steps moving back and forth across the floor directly over our heads. But they weren't alone. There were at least two, maybe three people walking around up there. The elderly man's eyes suddenly opened, and for a split second, they were completely alert and focused. He looked right at me, and I swear I saw something like an apology in his expression before his eyes rolled back and he went limp again. That's when Jake grabbed my arm and pointed to something I'd missed in my assessment. There were zip ties scattered around the mattress and what looked like restraints attached to pipes along the wall. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was a trap. I felt panic rising in my chest, but my training kicked in. We had to stay calm and think our way out of this. Jake was already examining the door at the top of the stairs, using his flashlight to look for any way to force it open. I stayed with the patient, but now I was wondering if he was actually sick or just playing a part in whatever this was. The footsteps above us stopped, and the silence was somehow worse than the sound had been. Then we heard voices, muffled, but definitely multiple people discussing something. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sounded like they were planning something. Jake came back down and whispered that the door was solid wood with what felt like a deadbolt on the other side. No way we were getting through it without tools we didn't have. That's when we heard a new sound outside, a car starting up. Through the tiny basement window, we saw headlights moving away from the house. "They're leaving," Jake said, but I wasn't sure if that was good news or bad news. We spent the next 20 minutes trying everything we could think of. Jake used his radio battery to try to boost our signal, but we were still getting nothing. We examined every inch of the basement looking for another way out, but the window was too small and too high, and there were no other doors. The elderly man's condition seemed to be genuinely deteriorating now, whether from whatever was actually wrong with him or from stress. I continued monitoring his vitals while Jake worked on finding an escape route. Then we heard the car coming back. Multiple car doors slamming, more voices outside, and they didn't sound friendly. Jake and I positioned ourselves near the stairs, ready to defend ourselves if necessary, when suddenly we heard shouting from outside. Different voices, authoritative ones. "Police! Open the door!" It turns out that our dispatch had tried to contact us for a welfare check when we went radio silent for too long. They'd sent a patrol unit to our last known location, and the officers had found our ambulance and investigated when no one answered the door. The people who lived in the house scattered when they saw the police, but Linda and two men were caught trying to flee through the backwoods. We never got the full story of what they had planned, but investigators found evidence that they'd done this before, luring first responders into isolated situations. The elderly man was Linda's father, and he did have medical issues, but he'd been coerced into participating in the scheme. He recovered after treatment at the hospital and was placed in protective custody while the investigation continued. I finished out my shift that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about how differently things could have gone. Jake and I both requested transfers to different districts after that. We still keep in touch, and neither of us takes rural calls alone anymore. The thing that haunts me most is how normal it all seemed at first. Just another call, just another patient who needed help. It's made me more cautious, maybe too cautious, but I'd rather be paranoid than trapped in someone's basement again. I found this on a Reddit thread by user medicmike87, and it perfectly captures why paramedics develop such strong instincts about dangerous situations. The knife was just sitting there on his kitchen counter, still wet with blood, when I walked into the apartment. The patient was standing calmly in the living room, smiling at me like nothing was wrong, but I could see dark stains on his shirt and hands. But let me back up and explain how I ended up in what was clearly a crime scene. It was a busy Saturday night in downtown Minneapolis. I was working with my regular partner, Amy, and we'd already run 6 calls since our shift started at 6 p.m. Around midnight, we got dispatched to a high-rise apartment building for what sounded like a straightforward medical call. Male in his 30s reporting severe abdominal pain and nausea. The building was one of those expensive downtown complexes with the doorman and marble floors in the lobby. Nothing about it screamed danger, which is probably why I wasn't as alert as I should have been. The doorman buzzed us up to the 15th floor without any questions, mentioning that he'd spoken to the tenant earlier and everything seemed fine. We took the elevator up, discussing our approach like we always did. Abdominal pain could be anything from food poisoning to appendicitis, so we'd need to do a thorough assessment. Amy had her cardiac monitor and drug bag, while I carried the stretcher and trauma kit. The hallway was quiet and well lit, typical of an upscale building. We found apartment 1547 and knocked on the door, announcing ourselves as paramedics. The door opened immediately, like the person had been waiting right behind it. The man who answered was tall and thin, probably in his early 30s, wearing jeans and a dark t-shirt. He seemed calm, maybe too calm for someone experiencing severe pain, but patients react differently to discomfort. He introduced himself as Marcus and invited us inside. That's when I should have trusted my instincts. The apartment was immaculate except for one thing. There were drops of what looked like blood leading from the front door toward the kitchen. Not a lot, but enough to create a clear trail across the hardwood floor. Marcus guided us toward the living room, explaining that he'd been experiencing sharp pains in his stomach for the past hour. His story was consistent, and he answered our initial questions appropriately, but something about his demeanor was setting off alarm bells in my head. Amy started taking his vital signs while I did a visual assessment of the scene. That's when I noticed more blood spots on the coffee table and what appeared to be defensive wounds on Marcus's knuckles. Fresh cuts that looked like they'd happened recently. When I asked him about the injuries on his hands, his whole personality shifted. The friendly, concerned patient facade dropped, and his eyes went cold. He said he'd cut himself while cooking earlier, but the wounds didn't look like kitchen accidents. That's when Amy caught my eye and nodded toward the kitchen. She'd seen something while positioning herself to take his blood pressure. I told Marcus we needed to check his pupils for signs of concussion since head injuries could cause nausea. And while he was distracted looking up at my pen light, I glanced toward the kitchen. The knife was laying on the counter next to the sink, and there was definitely blood on the blade. Not just a drop or two from a cooking accident, but enough to suggest it had been used for something more serious. There were also bloody paper towels scattered around the sink area, like someone had been trying to clean up in a hurry. Marcus was watching both of us now, and I could tell he'd realized we'd seen more than he wanted us to. His story about abdominal pain suddenly seemed like a lie designed to get medical personnel into his apartment. But why? Amy and I have worked together for 4 years, and we've developed a kind of communication that doesn't require words. I could see her subtly reaching for her radio, and I positioned myself between Marcus and the front door. "I think we should transport you to the hospital for further evaluation," I said, trying to keep my voice professional and calm. "The symptoms you're describing could indicate something serious." Marcus stood up from the couch, and that's when I noticed he was favoring his left side, like he was trying to hide an injury. There were also what looked like scratch marks on his neck, mostly hidden by his shirt collar. "Actually, I'm feeling better now," he said. "I don't think I need to go to the hospital after all." That's not how medical calls work. Once we're on scene and a patient has requested help, we need to either transport them or have them sign a refusal form. But Marcus seemed to be trying to get us to leave quickly, which raised even more red flags. Amy had managed to key her radio and was quietly requesting police backup, giving our location and indicating we needed assistance. I hoped Marcus couldn't hear the transmission, but from his reaction, I think he caught at least part of it. "Did you just call the cops?" he asked, and his voice had an edge to it now. "I told you I'm feeling better. I don't need an ambulance, and I sure as heck don't need police." I explained that it was standard protocol for certain types of calls, trying to de-escalate the situation while buying time for help to arrive. But Marcus was getting agitated, pacing around the living room and occasionally glancing toward the kitchen. I was starting to wonder if we were dealing with someone who had hurt another person and was now trying to figure out how to handle two witnesses. That's when we heard it. A sound coming from what I assumed was a bedroom down the hall. It was faint, but it sounded like someone was moaning or trying to call for help. Marcus heard it too, and his face went pale. "What was that?" Amy asked directly. "The TV," Marcus said quickly. "I left the TV on in the bedroom." But the sound came again, and this time it was clearly someone in distress. Amy and I exchanged looks, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. There was another person in this apartment who needed medical attention, and Marcus was preventing us from helping them. I made a decision that probably saved lives. I told Marcus that as medical professionals, we had a duty to assist anyone who needed help, and that sound indicated someone required medical attention. I started walking toward the hallway, despite his protests. Marcus stepped in front of me, and for a moment, I thought he was going to get physical. But that's when we heard sirens outside. The police response was faster than usual, probably because Amy had indicated officer safety concerns in her transmission. The sound of approaching sirens changed everything. Marcus seemed to deflate, like he realized the situation was beyond his control. He sat back down on the couch and put his head in his hands. Within minutes, police officers were knocking on the door. I let them in while Amy stayed with Marcus, and I quickly explained what we'd observed: the blood, the knife, the sounds from the back of the apartment. They found Marcus's girlfriend in the bedroom, badly beaten, but alive. She'd managed to lock herself in the bathroom and call 911, but Marcus had gotten to her phone before she could give dispatchers much information. Her call had been transferred to us as a medical emergency, which is how we ended up responding to what was actually a domestic violence situation in progress. Marcus was arrested without further incident. The girlfriend was transported to the hospital with serious but non-life-threatening injuries. She told police that Marcus had become violent during an argument and that she thought he was going to kill her before she managed to get away from him. The investigators said our quick thinking and Amy's request for police backup probably prevented the situation from getting much worse. Marcus was trying to figure out what to do about two witnesses when help arrived. I've been doing this job for 8 years now, and I've learned to trust those instincts when something doesn't feel right. The apartment was too clean, except for the blood. Marcus was too calm for someone in severe pain, and his story didn't match the evidence we could see. Amy and I both received commendations from the department for our handling of the situation. But honestly, I just feel grateful that we were able to help that woman and get out of there safely. It's a reminder that not every call is what it seems to be on the surface.
Story 3. This was shared with me on Instagram by Ashley Chen, and it shows how quickly a routine call can turn into a nightmare scenario. I was trapped in the back of my own ambulance with the man who had just confessed to multiple murders, and my partner was unconscious in the driver's seat after being attacked. The patient restraints were broken. He was between me and the only exit, and I could hear him talking about what he was going to do next. But let me explain how a simple psychiatric transport turned into the most terrifying experience of my career. I'd been working as a paramedic in Phoenix for about 5 years when this happened. My partner David and I specialized in psychiatric transports, which meant we dealt with a lot of patients experiencing mental health crises. It's challenging work, but usually rewarding when you can help someone get the treatment they need. This particular transport seemed routine when we got the assignment. We were supposed to pick up a 38-year-old male named Robert from a psychiatric facility and take him to a different hospital for evaluation. According to the paperwork, he'd been voluntarily admitted for depression and anxiety and now needed to be transferred for specialized treatment. The facility was one we'd worked with many times before: professional staff, good protocols, and they usually gave us thorough briefings about patient behavior and any special considerations. When we arrived, the charge nurse met us at the door with a clipboard and Robert's file. Robert appeared calm and cooperative. He was an average-looking guy in his late 30s, wearing hospital scrubs and slippers. He spoke quietly when answering our questions and seemed genuinely grateful that we were helping him get to the treatment he needed. Nothing about his demeanor suggested he might be dangerous. The nurse mentioned that Robert had been a model patient during his stay, participating in group therapy and following all the facility rules. His only medication was a mild anti-anxiety prescription, and he hadn't shown any signs of agitation or violent behavior. The transfer was supposed to be straightforward. We helped Robert into the back of the ambulance and secured him to the stretcher with standard soft restraints, more for safety during transport than because we expected problems. David got behind the wheel while I stayed in the back to monitor Robert during the 40-minute drive to the receiving hospital. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal. Robert was quiet but responsive when I checked on him. He mentioned being nervous about the transfer, but said he was looking forward to getting more specialized help. We talked about general topics, the weather, how long he'd been in Phoenix, nothing personal or triggering. The conversation changed when Robert started asking me questions about my job. He wanted to know how long I'd been a paramedic, what kind of calls I responded to, whether I ever seen anyone die. His questions became more specific and detailed, focusing on violent situations and traumatic calls. I tried to redirect the conversation, but Robert seemed fixated on death and violence. He asked if I had ever been scared during a call, if I had ever thought I might not make it home. His tone was still calm, almost conversational, but the subject matter was making me uncomfortable. That's when he started talking about his own experiences with violence. At first, I thought he was describing things he'd witnessed or maybe scenes from movies, but as he continued, the details became too specific and personal to be anything but first-hand accounts. Robert described attacking someone in a parking garage, talking about it like he was discussing a trip to the grocery store. He mentioned how surprised his victim was, how they tried to fight back but weren't strong enough. The casualness in his voice was chilling. I reached for my radio to contact David in the front cab, but Robert noticed my movement and his whole demeanor shifted. The calm, cooperative patient disappeared, and someone completely different was looking back at me. His eyes were focused and predatory in a way that made my skin crawl. "Don't do that," he said quietly. "We're having such a nice conversation." I realized the soft restraints weren't actually securing him to the stretcher. He'd somehow worked his hands free without me noticing, and now he was sitting up on the gurney like the restraints weren't there at all. I couldn't understand how he'd gotten loose so quickly and quietly. Robert continued talking about his attacks, describing 3 different people he claimed to have killed in the past 6 months. He provided details that were too specific to be made up: locations,
victim descriptions, methods used. I was listening to a confession from someone who had been masquerading as a psychiatric patient. I tried to signal David through the partition window, but Robert was watching my every movement now. When I reached for the radio again, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His grip was firm enough to hurt, but not enough to leave marks. I said, "Don't do that. I'm not done telling you about my work yet." That's when I realized the psychiatric admission might have been a cover story. Robert had voluntarily committed himself to a psychiatric facility where he'd been the perfect patient for 2 weeks, establishing a history of cooperation and stability. The transfer to another facility was his exit strategy. He started describing his plans for after the transport, talking about how he'd already identified his next victim and where he was going to strike next. The level of detail and planning he described was terrifying. This wasn't someone having violent fantasies. This was someone who had killed before and was planning to kill again. I looked toward the front of the ambulance, hoping to catch David's attention, but I could see he was focused on navigation and traffic. The partition between the cab and patient area was thick enough that he couldn't hear our conversation over the road noise. Robert noticed me looking forward and smiled. "He can't help you," he said. "And when we get to the hospital, I'm going to walk away like nothing happened." Who's going to believe that a cooperative psychiatric patient confessed to multiple murders during a routine transport? That's when I realized how carefully this had been planned. Robert had researched how psychiatric transports worked, had gotten himself admitted to a facility he knew did transfers, and had maintained perfect behavior until he was alone with medical personnel who wouldn't be believed if they reported what he told them. I was trying to figure out how to alert David without provoking Robert when the ambulance suddenly swerved and began slowing down rapidly. David was pulling over to the side of the highway, and I could see him slumping forward in the driver's seat. Robert had somehow gotten to David without my noticing. Later, investigators found a small syringe in Robert's possession. He'd apparently drugged David through the partition window while I was distracted by his confession. David was unconscious but still breathing, and the ambulance was now stopped on the shoulder of a busy highway. Robert stood up from the stretcher, completely free from any restraints. I don't know how he learned to escape from medical restraints so effectively, but he moved around the back of the ambulance like he owned it. He was between me and the rear doors, and David was unconscious in the locked cab. "Now we have some privacy," Robert said, and his voice carried a threat that made my blood run cold. I was trapped in my own workplace with someone who had just confessed to being a serial killer, and no one knew we were in danger. Our radio checks weren't scheduled for another 15 minutes, and we were on a stretch of highway where traffic was light. Robert started moving towards me, and I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a large flashlight we kept mounted on the wall. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was heavy enough to do damage if I could use it effectively. "You don't want to do that," Robert said, but he stopped advancing. I was hoping we could handle this without anyone getting hurt. I told him that people would be looking for us soon, that our dispatch would notice when we didn't arrive on schedule. But Robert just laughed and said he'd planned for that too. He'd been studying how MES systems worked for months. That's when I heard the sound that probably saved my life. A police siren approaching us from behind. A highway patrol officer had noticed the ambulance stopped on the shoulder and was pulling over to check if we needed assistance. Robert heard it too, and for the first time, he looked worried. His perfect plan was falling apart because of a routine welfare check by law enforcement. He moved towards the rear doors, and I thought he was going to try to run. But instead of fleeing, Robert tried to get back on the stretcher and pretend to be restrained again. He wanted to maintain his cover as a cooperative psychiatric patient, but it was too late. I was already banging on the rear doors and shouting for help.
The highway patrol officer opened the back doors just as Robert was trying to position the restraints to look like they were still securing him. The officer immediately recognized that something was wrong and called for backup while securing Robert properly. David recovered after being treated for the drug Robert had given him, which turned out to be a powerful sedative stolen from the psychiatric facility. Robert was arrested and eventually charged with multiple counts